Dear students, welcome back to our sixth lecture of macroeconomics on key aggregates of the macroeconomy. In this lecture, we will learn how to diagnose the health of an economy or how well the macroeconomy of a country like the United States or Egypt is doing over time. Specifically, we will look at the key aggregates that help identify the state of the macroeconomy. We also look at how the macroeconomy works in practice, or the way in which it works. Concepts and problems of the macroeconomy. When the macroeconomy is doing well, jobs are easy to be found, incomes are generally rising, reaching high levels, and profits of corporations or companies are typically high. If the macroeconomy is in a slump or in a less than good state, new jobs are scarce, hard to be found, incomes are not growing, they are at low levels, profits are also at low levels. Given the large effect that the macroeconomy can have on our lives, it is important that we understand how it works or the way in which it works. We will look at two specific things here. One, macroeconomic concerns or problems of the macroeconomy, where we describe three primary concerns or key aggregates of macroeconomics. Two, the components of the macroeconomy, where we discuss the interaction between the four components of the macroeconomy. What is aggregate behavior? This is the behavior of all households and firms together in the macroeconomy. What are sticky prices? These are prices that do not always adjust rapidly to maintain equality between quantity supplied and quantity demanded in the macroeconomy. Aggregates and concerns of the macroeconomy. There are three major concerns or aggregates of macroeconomics or macroeconomies. These are: number one, output growth; two, unemployment; and finally, inflation and deflation. What is the business cycle? This is the cycle of short-term ups and downs in the economy. Aggregate output is the total quantity of goods and services produced in an economy in a given period. What is a recession? This is a period during which aggregate output declines, conventionally a period in which aggregate output declines for 2 consecutive quarters. What is a depression? This is a prolonged and deep recession. What is expansion or boom? This is the period in the business cycle from a trough up to a peak during which output and employment grow. What is a contraction, recession, or a slump? This is the period in the business cycle from a peak down to a trough during which output and employment fall. Unemployment. One key aggregate that help identify the state of the macroeconomy is the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is the percentage of the labor force that is in the state of unemployment, or the percentage of the labor force that is unemployed. The existence of unemployment in an economy seems to imply that the aggregate labor force is not in equilibrium. That is, the labor market in the economy is not in an equilibrium state. The components of the macroeconomy. To see the big picture of the macroeconomy, usually we divide the participants in the macroeconomy into 4 broad groups or categories. Number 1, households. 2, firms. 3, the government. Number 4, the rest of the world. Typically, households make decisions about buying consumer goods. Firms make decisions about capital goods. The government make decisions about both consumer and capital goods. The rest of the world makes decisions about imports and exports in the form of both consumer and capital goods. Households and firms make up the private sector. The government is or represents the public sector. And finally, the rest of the world constitutes or forms the foreign sector of the economy. To learn how the macroeconomy works in practice, we should have an idea of the so-called the circular flow diagram. The circular flow diagram is a diagram showing the flows in and out of the sectors, the 4 sectors of the macroeconomy: households, firms, the government, and the foreign sector. Now, what are transfer payments? These are cash payments made by the government to people who do not supply goods, services, or labor in exchange for these payments. They receive these payments with no effort done on their part to produce goods, services, or labor. They include Social Security benefits, veterans benefits, and welfare benefits. The figure we have here shows the circular flow of payments among the 4 sectors: firms on the left, households on the right, the rest of the world on the top, and in the middle between firms and households we see the government. We can see that households receive income from firms, and the government purchase goods and services from firms and pay taxes to the government. They also purchase foreign-made goods and services, which we call imports. Firms receive payments from households and the government for goods and services, where they pay wages, dividends, interest, and rents to households and taxes to the government. The government in turn receives taxes from firms and households. The government pays firms and households for goods and services, including wages to government workers or employees, and it pays interest and transfers to households. Finally, we see that people in other countries purchase goods and services produced domestically within the country, which are called exports. Note that although not shown in this diagram, we should note that firms and governments also purchase imports in their turn. The three markets of the macroeconomy. Another way to look at the ways households, firms, the government, and the rest of the world relate to one another is to consider the markets in which they interact. We divide the markets into three broad arenas. The first is the goods and services market, or for short, the goods market. The second market is the labor market. And the third and final market of the macroeconomy is the money market or the financial market. Let's begin with the goods market, the goods and services market. In that market, we see that households and the government purchase or buy goods and services from firms or companies in the goods and services market. We also see that firms purchase or buy goods and services from each other and also supply or provide the goods and services market. While households, the government, and firms demand from this market. Finally, the rest of the world buys or purchases from and sells to the goods and services market. The second market of the macroeconomy is the labor market. In the labor market, we see that households is the provider of the labor service, or simply supply labor, and firms and the government demand labor. Labor is also supplied to and demanded from the rest of the world. The third market of the macroeconomy is the money market or the financial market. In that market, we see households supply or the provider of funds to the money market or financial market in the expectation of earning income in the form of dividends on stocks and interest on bonds. So the return households earn on bonds is called interest, while the return households earn on stocks are called dividends. Households also demand or borrow funds from this market to finance various purchases. Finally, firms borrow in the money market or the financial market to build new facilities, new machines, new factories, and so on, in the hope of earning more in the future to earn or gain profit. In the money market or the financial market, the government borrows money or funds by issuing bonds. The rest of the world borrows from and lends to the money market. Much of this borrowing and lending is coordinated by financial institutions, normally called banks, which take deposits from one group and lend them to others. But what are the main sources of funds or the key financial instruments that can be used in the money market or the financial market? The answer to this question is that there are three major financial instruments that are bought and sold in the financial or the money market. These are: 1. Treasury bonds, notes, or bills. And these are promissory notes issued by the federal government or the central government when it borrows money from the money or financial market. The second instrument is corporate bonds. These are promissory notes issued by corporations or companies when they borrow money. And finally, shares of stock, or for short, stocks. These are financial instruments that give to the holder a share in the firm's ownership and therefore the right to share in the firm's profits. What are dividends? These represent the portion of a firm's profits that the firm pays out each period to its shareholders. The role of the government in the macroeconomy. Typically, the government undertakes its role in the macroeconomy using two main policies. The first is the fiscal policy, the second is the monetary policy. Fiscal policy is the government policy regarding or concerning taxes and spending, or for short, the policy that is related to using taxes and spending by the government. The other main policy undertaken by the government is the so-called monetary policy, and it refers to the tools used by the central bank, like the Central Bank of Egypt, or in the United States by the Federal Reserve, to control, to change short-term interest rates. What is the Great Depression? The Great Depression is the period of severe economic contraction and high unemployment that began in 1929 and continued through the 1930s in Western economies. What is fine-tuning? The phrase used to refer to the government's role in regulating inflation, keeping inflation down, and also keeping unemployment down. What is stagflation? This is a situation of both high inflation and high unemployment. So in times of stagflation, we see both inflation and unemployment together taking place. The chart we have here shows aggregate output in the form of real GDP for the United States during the period 1970 first quarter through 1914 the fourth quarter. It shows aggregate output in the United States since 1970s has risen overall, but there have been 5 recessionary periods. Those were 1974 first quarter to 1975 first quarter, also 1980 second quarter through 1982 fourth quarter. The third is during the period 1990 third quarter through 1991 first quarter, and the fourth recessionary period for the period 2001 first quarter through 2001 third quarter, and 2008 first quarter, 2009 second quarter. The chart we have here shows unemployment rate for the United States during the period 1970 first quarter through 1914 the fourth quarter. We see that the U.S. unemployment rate since 1970 shows wide variations or fluctuations. The 5 recessionary reference periods show increases in the unemployment rate. The chart we have here shows in the inflation rate in the form of the percentage change in the GDP deflator 4-quarter average during the period 1970 first quarter through 1914 the fourth quarter. And as we can see from the chart, since 1970 inflation has been high in 2 periods. Those are 1973 fourth quarter through 1975 fourth quarter and 1979 first quarter through 1981 fourth quarter. Inflation between 1983 and 1992 was moderate. Since 1992, it has been fairly low. At the end of this lecture, make sure that you have a good understanding of the following: aggregate behavior, aggregate output, the business cycle, the circular flow, contraction, recession or slump, corporate bonds, deflation, depression, dividends, expansion or boom, fine-tuning, fiscal policy, Great Depression, the hyperinflation, inflation, macroeconomics, microeconomics, monetary policy, recession, shares of stock, stagflation, sticky prices, transfer payments, treasury bonds, notes and bills, and finally the unemployment rate.